Must political philosophy refrain from being utopian? It's quite fashionable in the 21st century for much of political philosophy to be dominated by criticisms of utopianism or idealism. It is the, maybe we could say, current paradigm that we're operating in for there to be criticisms of the kind of idealizing that goes on in political philosophy. And it's maybe, at least even indirect efforts in perpetuating kinds of injustice. Must political philosophy then be useful if it is to be valuable? Isn't it a criticism of utopianism that it's not useful, whether it be to revolutionary politics or even just any kind of politics seeking to, keep a stable political order? And is there a difference between how one lives and how one ought to live? Such that, well, we should base our theory, perhaps if we want to be more realistic, on how people actually live. Or there's this issue of how do we bridge this gap between how one lives and how one ought to live? Well, what David Estlund does is he argues that moral theories of social justice, political authority, political legitimacy, and many other moral political concepts are not shown to be defective if the alleged requirements or preconditions of these things are not likely ever to be met. So it is no defect of a theory if its standards are so high that we would say, well, no one is actually going to be able, or no one is actually going to live according to those standards. David Estlund says, so I never said they would. And that doesn't mean the theory isn't true, even if people don't live up to its standards. So what does it mean to be realistic in political theorizing? Estlund defines complacent realism as the most realistic normative theory of all the different kinds of normative theories. That would be one that recommends people and institutions be exactly as they actually are already, or exactly as they will come to be if maybe we're thinking about a bit teleologically. I think most people would reject the idea that, well, political philosophy should be realist to the degree that it should just model itself on how people already behave, especially if we want to say, well, how people already behave is to, engage in practices that are unjust. And if we want to overcome that, if we want to realize justice, and we say, well, how people actually behave isn't always just, that doesn't really allow us to in any way try to influence politics for the sake of justice or for the sake of any other kind of virtue. So Estlund thinks basically everyone is going to reject complacent realism. So we can already say there's no point in doing any kind of normative theorizing that's just going to say, well, people should just ought to behave exactly as they already do. Aspirational theory, though, basically says, look, it's not utopian insofar as it aims at something which is beyond all maybe human capacities, or it's of no place, or it's transcendent or universal, and so in that way literally ahistorical. It's not a complacent realism either, because aspirational theory doesn't just say, well, we should do what people already do or what they're most likely to do. It is a kind of theory that says, well, we want to work within the framework we're given to get the best possible maybe organization of society. And even someone like John Rawls, who of course is an ideal theorist, his kind of a theory is an aspirational theory. Right? He calls his philosophy a realistic utopianism, insofar as it's not wildly utopian, arguing for something, like the form of justice, but it's also not a kind of complacent realism. Rawls really sees himself as kind of bridging the gap between those, extreme realism and extreme utopianism. But Estlund thinks even that is being too concessive to certain kinds of facts or certain kinds of realist demands that don't actually get at the truth of justice. He thinks this stems from what he calls utopophobia, an unreasonable fear of utopianism, which can lead to the marginalization of inquiries and insights that do not suffer the defects of utopianism properly conceived. So anyone who is a utopophobe is basically one who is so afraid of engaging in any kind of idealizing that they end up actually losing out on certain kinds of insights, whether they just be any kind of like intuition pumps or anything like that, that utopian thinking might offer. A theory can be too unrealistic when a conception of society posits moral standards for people or institutions that is beyond their abilities to ever live up to. So, of course, a theory would be too unrealistic if it says, well, human beings ought to flap their wings and fly around. It's quite impossible for any human being to flap their wings because human beings don't have wings. So any kind of a theory like that, which is based on just false data or false information or false facts, these are impossible. They have impossible standards. And any kind of a theory like that, Estlund says, would be false and should be rejected. But just saying that people will never live up to any kind of a moral principle or moral standard doesn't, it's not clear that it necessarily means that that standard or that principle is false. So we might say no human being should ever, grow past 6 feet tall, right? Well, that's impossible, at least as our current standards are. I don't know that we have any kind of a, medical genetic system that stops people from growing past 6 feet tall. But Estlund wants to say, well, look, if you want to say any kind of a standard which says that not everybody can actually do, or really not everybody actually will do, because there's a difference, there's many of those circumstances that we wouldn't reject. So in the case of a moral principle against lying, a moral principle against theft, or a moral principle against murder, right? Estlund thinks that we would admit, yeah, we should probably have a moral principle that says one shouldn't murder, and yet we know that there are likely still going to be people that engage in murder. Does that mean that just because inevitably there will be some people such that not every person actually can live up to that standard or that principle, should we then reject the principle that murder is bad? Should we reject the principle that theft is bad? Estlund thinks no. That, like, even someone who, like John Rawls, right, an aspirational theorist, even most realists, Estlund thinks, wouldn't reject a principle like one shouldn't murder or one shouldn't lie or something like that, just because not everybody is actually going to live up to that principle. There are two ways we can understand an action being impossible. One would be that it sometimes means that an agent cannot do it, that they're literally unable to do it, insofar as, flying through the sky with wings. A human being, as far as I know, no human being has wings. They're literally unable to do that. So it might be a principle that said, well, anytime a human being should save any individual in any kind of circumstance, no matter what. Well, it's not actually possible for everyone to save all human beings in any kind of a circumstance, no matter what. But another way that we could say an action is impossible is to say that there's no chance that they will do it, that the objective probability of them doing it is zero. And that's very different. It's to say, look, as far as we know how people behave, not everybody actually is going to do it. And perhaps we can even predict that not everybody is going to be able to do it. But that's very different from saying they literally can't do it, that they don't have the ability to do it. Estlund admits, if anything cannot literally be done, it shouldn't be a moral principle that we should impose on individuals. But just to say that, well, people aren't going to do it, that it's not reasonable to expect people to do it, that's not a good reason, because that's not going against any kind of fact of human beings, according to Estlund. So what he does is advocates what he calls hopeless aspirational theory. So consider a theory that holds individuals and institutions to standards that it is within their ability to meet, but that there is good reason to believe they will never meet. Is this a defect? Well, this kind of a theory doesn't predict that these standards will someday be met. It's not a predictive theory. Many things that are within people's abilities will never be done. It's within my ability, probably, or at least it was when I was younger, to join a at least semi-professional soccer team. I didn't do it, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have been done. So it wouldn't make sense to not have that goal when I was younger of trying to join a semi-professional soccer team. So what we need to look at is certain kinds of theories that propose standards that might be higher than what individuals maybe want to do. It might be higher than what individuals will do. But as long as it is not a standard or a principle which doesn't allow people to actually do it because people actually don't have the ability, they don't have the capabilities to do it, then the defect, according to Estlund, is not with the people. The defect is with the people. It's not with the theory. So the problem of utopianism is not that its standards are too high. It's that people aren't good enough. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still strive, even if we will fail, and even if we have good reason to believe that we will fail. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to live according to those principles and standards. Now, some criticisms of this kind of a hopeless aspirational theory are that it can be dangerous because the soundness of the standards might lead some to take actions in their pursuit that will be bad. So it might be the case that how some people think that it means to never murder no matter what would mean that some people might then, not save someone from a murderer because they don't want to murder the murderer. And maybe in some circumstances, right, even according to a hopeless aspirational theory, it might admit, yeah, sometimes we might want to do something like that. Or that actions in pursuit of what will never be achieved can be wasteful or even disastrous. So we might end up wasting our time trying to achieve the standards that a hopeless aspirational theory sets out in place of doing more immediate good. So it might be the case that aspirational theory says, hey, we should, try to eliminate poverty worldwide, and it might be in trying to do that, we don't actually do something like give everyone health care in the United States immediately, which we could do, whereas it might take a little bit longer to alleviate poverty worldwide. Now, whether that actually is correct or not, right, I don't know, but it's just an example of where it might be the case that maybe because of the time it might take to alleviate poverty, that we should do something more immediate first, while keeping the other thing in mind, of course, but that we shouldn't deny more immediate goals, even if they aren't as grandiose or they aren't the ultimate aims of a theory. Another way that a hopeless theory can be dangerous is that some people might be led by unrealistically high standards to improve themselves or their institutions. The world, though, is not brought closer to the ideal by having the institutions called for in the ideal, even while citizens are far from living up to it. Rather, those institutions can actually make things worse. So it might be the case that people then try to improve currently existing institutions that are just objectively bad. And so that might lead to disastrous consequences because of what those institutions, by trying to change them, what they might do. Estlund calls a hopeful, realistic normative political theory one that applies appropriate standards that are not only possible for people and institutions to meet, but that it is also reasonable to believe they might meet. So a hopeful, realistic normative political theory then tries to, of course, bridge this kind of a gap where they say, we're not going to waste our time on the utopian ideals, but we're also not going to be super realistic. We're going to say, hey, we want to be hopeful, but we want to try to work in changes that are actually reasonable. Such theories, Estlund thinks, can be criticized for demanding that something is possible, though, but more than can be reasonably demanded. And an example of this he has in mind something like utilitarian demands, where it might be the demand that one should, whether this be the case that one should be altruistic, and yet that kind of a demand is actually probably unreasonable because most people aren't going to be fully altruistic. Estlund thinks that these kinds of theories are harsh theories, and ultimately they're actually false because they demand more than can be reasonably expected. So those kinds of theories as well, that once again try to bridge the gap where they say, yes, we want those ultimate aims of what the idealists or what the utopians want of justice, but we're going to be more realistic, more calculated about how we go about it so as to avoid some of those dangers of a hopeless theory. One example of this might be, the effective altruism movement led by many, or influenced by many utilitarians and led by many of them. Estlund then comes to defend hopeless aspirational theory. He says, first, we can have a concessive normative theory that aims to supplement hopeless aspirational theory, and that is not inimical to it in any way. That we can have, in a sense, a more non-ideal, so in this sense, concessive to the realities of how people live, but which doesn't deny the ultimate aims that a hopeless aspirational theory aims at. So given that certain sound moral principles of politics aren't likely to be met, we can go on to ask, what should be done then? If voters, for example, will be lazy and selfish, then what should we do politically in light of that fact? But we don't deny that we want to aim at the ideal of not lying, of not being selfish, of not being lazy. So we actually have two kinds of theories that work hand in hand, but of course, the concessive normative theory is going to be guided by the hopeless aspirational theory. The reason why you can't just get rid of hopeless aspirational theory is because ultimately all theories, even those that are fully dependent, or at least they think they're fully dependent, on being sensitive to facts, they're still ultimately justified by some more ultimate fact-insensitive principle. Estlund gives this example where he says S ought to do X and Y does not entail S ought to do X and S ought to do Y. So that S ought to do X only makes sense because of the ought, because of the normative force, the normative justification for doing X and Y, such that you can't divorce S ought to do X and S ought to do Y. He says the analogy, of course, is that it might be that a society ought to build and comply with certain institutions. That is a moral, practical prescription. But if they will not comply, it might well be that they morally ought not to build those institutions. The important point here is that this would not in any way cancel or invalidate the prescription to build and comply. So S ought to do X, which might be build, and S ought to do Y, which might comply. Just because people might not comply doesn't mean they ought not to build. Again, the reason is a meta-theoretical justification. Ultimately, it comes from G.A. Cohen that any principle, that the principle Y, though fact-sensitive, is justified only by a more ultimately fact-insensitive principle X. And those cannot be divorced. Estlund doesn't want his idea of a hopeless aspirational theory to be likened to those of John Rawls's, ideal theories, for example, or even necessarily a Platonic conception of justice. Although he does somewhat liken hopeless aspirational theory to Platonic conception of justice. But there's a big difference. Ideal theory often means full compliance and or complete and universal moral virtue. So full compliance theory chooses between principles of justice on the assumption that those principles would be fully complied with by the people in that society. So, John Rawls is going to set out and ask, okay, what would the principles be that would be fully complied to? And whatever those are the kinds of principles we should aim at. Likewise, on the other hand, then, a complete and universal moral virtue takes people not as they are, but as they ought morally to be, assuming they are morally good. So in both cases, what these kinds of ideal theories do is they set out either principles that are fully complied to or human beings that are fully good. The problem, though, for Estlund is that people don't fully comply with principles of justice, and people aren't fully morally good. So his hopeless aspirational theory is a different kind of theory, a utopian ideal theory. So full compliance theory and complete universal and moral virtue theories, they make intentionally false assumptions about the facts, making their conclusions conditional on those counterfactual assumptions, like full compliance with the principles of justice, which is false. That is not actually how the world is. That's not how people behave. And that people are fully morally good. That's not how people actually are. So in this way, actually, Estlund is saying hopeless aspirational theory is not based on false assumptions like other kinds of ideal theories of justice. Hopeless aspirational theories of justice do not assume that people will comply, or that they have certain simplified motives, or that they are morally good. It only says that society is morally required to be a certain way, a way that perhaps it never will be, owing to facts about people and the like. He says the difference is between saying that we should have certain institutions if people are good, the requirement being conditional on their being good, and saying it is required that people be good and have certain institutions. The requirement not being conditional on their being good because people aren't actually good. So it shouldn't matter that people aren't actually good. They should just be good because it's true. It's just that people be good. Estlund considers three objections. The first is, would a perfect people need politics, right? I mean, this is kind of the basic utopian, well, what's the point of politics in a utopian situation? Because everybody would be good, it seems like you wouldn't even need something like justice. And Estlund is to say, why does that question matter? What would it matter whether a perfect people need politics or not? Because, well, people aren't already perfect. As he says, a political theory gives an account of justice, authority, legitimacy, or some other central normative political value, and is confronted by an objection on grounds of realism. We all know, it is said, that people will never act in the ways this theory says that justice, or authority, or legitimacy is said to depend upon their behaving. I have argued that it is an adequate reply to point out that the theory never said they would. It only said that there would not be justice or authority or legitimacy, either fully or to some stated degree, unless they did. The second objection. It's not clear that it makes any sense for a theory to concede all the facts about what we will do, since that would leave nothing open to be normative about. Estlund responds by saying, even if we knew all the facts, including what everyone will do, unless every alternative is beyond people's abilities, all normative theory must be partly aspirational, purporting to recommend or require some things even if they will not be done. That there are important theoretical truths of a hopeless aspirational kind, then, should be beyond dispute. The final objection he considers is that even if a hopeless aspirational theory is true, what good is it? Why does it have any value? His response is that the great achievements in the development of human social life have typically been preceded by incredulity about their very possibility, much less their likelihood. If theoretical inquiry had limited itself to what was plausibly thought to be achievable, the achievements might never have happened. For at least this reason, we ought not to lower our gaze in a practical and realistic spirit. And here he mentions, for example, studying pure mathematics, where it's not clear that there is any practical value to studying pure mathematics. Or even we could think about the fact that, what led to the invention of MRI machines actually came from technology developed for spaceflight. So we might be pursuing advancements in one area, and it just so happens that they lead to improvements in other more immediately practical ways. So we shouldn't just not pursue something just because we don't see an immediate benefit by pursuing it. All of this is to say that even if we admit people, human beings, will not live up to the standards, to the principles of justice, does not mean that they aren't still the kinds of principles and standards that we should pursue and base our society around.